Well, joining me now in Washington, D.C. is Nour Rudman. She was the U.S. State Department's Deputy Envoy for Middle East Peace. In Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank, we have former Palestinian Authority spokeswoman Nour Odeh, and Diker joins us from West Jerusalem. He's the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Nour, let me start with you. So the State Department drops the word or the phrase occupied territories. It drops the word occupied. It changes Israeli occupied to Israeli controlled. Is it clear that this is more than just a change in terminology? It's a change in policy, perhaps?
No, it's not clear that it's a change in policy. The change in this wording came in the Country Human Rights Reports, which is an annual report that the State Department releases. The depth of what was in the Country Human Rights Reports with respect to Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, the wording of the substance of those reports, I compared what was in 2018's report, which is the report that just came out in March of this year, with what was in the report in 2017, and the criticisms of Israel and of the West Bank and Gaza were quite similar. But you're absolutely right that what was significantly different is that the word occupied did not appear. So that was a decision that was made at the State Department and or the White House to remove that word. We can't know what the origins of that decision was, whether it was influenced by some discussions between the highest levels of this administration and Israel, but it is significant that that word disappeared, and that is a change from how previous administrations, Democratic and Republican, have handled it, and even how this administration handled it just last year.
Right.
So some decision was made, but it is hard with this administration to describe that as a change in policy. It was a decision of the moment. And I would also say significantly different than even how prior Israeli leaders have handled that terminology. Even someone as conservative as Premier Ariel Sharon in 2003 used the word occupation. So this is a shift, and probably without a lot of deep thought from this administration.
Diker, are you pleased that they dropped the word occupied?
Imran, let me just correct my colleague in Washington. Ariel Sharon used the word occupation, but the Hebrew the Hebrew etymology of the word occupation is conquering. Israel did, in a defensive war, conquer the former illegally occupied Jordanian West Bank in 1967. The terminology was dropped by this administration. It was actually a correct move by the administration because the proper international legal nomenclature would be disputed territories. That means that both Israel and the Palestinians are, as claimants, are in a dispute. And in fact, the Oslo Accords, which was internationally witnessed and guaranteed by the United Nations and the European Union, Egypt, and the international community, have actually empowered this bilateral disagreement, this dispute, that would only be solved by negotiation. So the idea that Israel, this use of the word illegally occupied is incorrect, and in fact has been weaponized by countries and people all over the world, led by the UN incorrectly, in order to cynically accuse Israel of some sort of illegal move, when in fact it was completely legal according to international law, Israel having entered the West Bank in a war of self-defense. And by the way, there was no former sovereign there, so you can't have occupation when there's no sovereign.
Okay, I'm going to bring Nour in a second, but just for clarity, Dan, between 48 and 67, you believe the Jordanians did occupy the West Bank, but now the Israelis do not.
No, it's not what I say. It's as Ahmed Trigiv Lai, who was the first Secretary General of the United Nations, said of the Jordanian invasion in 1948. This was the first act of aggression since the Second World War. Those are his words, not mine.
Nour Odeh, let's bring the Palestinian in Ramallah in. Your response to Dan?
Well, I mean, I really don't want to engage in an argument over attempts to rewrite history and to rearrange the chips in international law and international narrative to fit the narrow definition of the right wing in Israel. The word occupation and the use of the word occupation is a legal qualification. It is endorsed by all bodies of the United Nations, including the International Court of Justice. It is a reality that the Palestinian people have endured since 1967. and it is there in defiance of the UN Charter. The acquisition of territory by force is an illegal act. I think, in fact, if you really want to be correct about the reality here, we should be calling Israel's control for what it is. It is a colonial occupation, not just a military occupation. It has gone on for over half a century. It is illegal, and it keeps an entire population captive. But going back to the subject of the discussions, the report by this administration, I think this is not about semantics. The fact that the Trump administration dropped the word occupation, it's not about whims, and it's not about last-minute changes. It is about the narrative and the perspective of this administration that only sees the conflict and the Palestinian issue through the lens of the right wing in Israel, particularly the settler movement, to which the American ambassador to Israel belongs. And so not using the word occupation, referring to Palestinians as residents in the West Bank and negating the fact that they are a people with deep historic roots to the country and national claims that are recognized internationally it reflects the true essence of the policy of the Trump administration towards the region, endorsing and accepting and mainstreaming Israel's right-wing policy and negating Palestinian statehood and national aspirations, and also discarding any respect or semblance thereof to international law and to the international consensus about this conflict.
Dan?
You know, with great eloquence, my colleague in Ramallah has basically misled the international community watching this program. There is no such thing as an illegal occupation. There's an occupation. Occupation is a legal term that does not apply to the sui generis situation in the West Bank. Let's be very clear. The Jordanians bombed Jerusalem in 1967, bringing Israel into Judea and Samaria, which is part of the 3,000-year-old Israeli territory. However, when Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization signed the Oslo Interim Agreement in 1995, following the Oslo Exchange of Letters in 93, this whole issue of occupation, settler colonialism is an absurdity, because you have an agreement by two parties to resolve their differences diplomatically and bilaterally. So when my colleague in Ramallah starts calling Israel a settler colonial implant, it really reflects what she truly believes, is that in her view, and in the view of Dr. Saeb Erekat and even Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, Israel has no right to exist anywhere in the Middle East as a nation state of the Jewish people in any borders, period. That's their position, and they dress it up in this elegant language that's completely nonsensical.
No.
Do you accept Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people?
Misleading the conversation.
Nour, do you accept Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people in any borders whatsoever in the Middle East?
No. I'm not here. I'm not here to prove anything to you, sir. Israel is a state.
No, you're not proving. You're accusing Israel.
It has yet to declare. It has yet to declare its borders. Israel is the only member state of the United Nations that has yet to define its borders. It is an anomaly in international
That's because
policy.
You don't accept Israel any borders.
Israel is a state. You can call yourself whatever you want.
Okay, hold on.
No.
Okay, so hold on, both of you, both Nour and Dan.
You can call yourself whatever you want.
Okay.
But you cannot require the Palestinian people to recognize you in a way that negates their own history and roots.
Okay,
and so I'm not going to engage with you in that discussion.
Okay, Nour and Dan, I want to put a pause on this for a second, and I want to ask Mara, from the US, the Trump administration's perspective, what is the message then to the Palestinians if we fold in the other issues of the embassy move to Jerusalem, the cutting of funding to USAID, and other such moves? The message to the Palestinians is what?
Well, I think one thing that we could all agree on is that I'm not somebody who should be speaking about from the Trump administration's perspective, or what their perspective is. As an outsider, someone who does not serve in that administration, and has not served in that administration, and I want to be clear, I was an appointee
you worked within the system in the past. I'm
other administrations.
With these moves, what message are they sending to the Palestinians?
I believe that and I want to be clear about what just happened. This was because what I have done is served in administration, so I know what these things are and what they're not. And I I actually travel within the realm of facts and understanding how very politicized all these issues are. This was a State Department country human rights report. And words do matter, and I appreciate that. And I've worked also on these issues long enough to understand just how much emotions travel also and how high rhetoric is. But this was a change, the wording change, I appreciate the significance of. However, the depth of the reporting within what was written about Israel and what was written about the West Bank and Gaza, I would still call to people's attention. There was a lot of substance there that was highly critical of all parties. So yes, the overall tenor of where President Trump is and where Secretary Pompeo is very different with respect to the Israelis and the Palestinians than their predecessors were. And President Trump is very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu. That should come as no surprise to anyone in the world. He's also very close to the Gulf leadership.
Right.
That should come as no surprise to anyone in the world.
Okay.
And the reporting right now in the country human rights report and the change of this wording is consistent with those close relationships.
Okay,
that happens when the United States elects new leadership.
Okay, Dan, I want to ask you a question to build on that. Dan,
Imran,
just a second.
let me just
a second. I want to. You can build on it, right? You can answer the two together. So Mara made an interesting point, where say groups like Amnesty International, human rights groups, Human Rights Watch, Israeli NGOs like B'Tselem will criticize Israeli human rights violations, for example, in the West Bank. And this report has done exactly the same as well, but it's just not used the word occupation. So do you accept that it's very similar as a human rights report to the criticism that has come from other human rights organizations as well?
Well, one thing we need to establish, Imran, is that most of the so-called human rights organizations, whether it's Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, or even some of the Israeli human rights organizations, are really radical political organizations with a very specific political agenda. And we saw it at the UN Special Investigative Committee just 48 hours ago, where they come out with a totally mendacious, completely undocumented, unprofessional, and monstrously disfigured report, not based on fact and based on political agenda, that accuses Israel's of crimes that North Korea and the Iranian regime commit every day.
But Dan, would you accept when Human Rights Watch comes out and it says that Hamas is killing dissidents within Gaza, do you believe that they are equally biased against Hamas as well?
That's actually a good question. I depend much more on independent reports that really come out of the Israeli military intelligence, which has actually the finest connections in Gaza and in the West Bank of any organization.
So you only
anywhere.
respect the reporting of the Israeli military on itself?
I respect the reporting of the most robust democracy in the world besides the United States, and that's the State of Israel. And Israel has both very objective reporting on itself, and anybody that spent any time in Israel knows that.
Okay.
And we also accept some independent reporting, but that independent NGO reporting has to be checked very carefully, as NGO Monitor, headed by Professor Gerald Steinberg, has proven time and time again of the biased, unfair, inequitable type of accusations that are regularly launched against Israel. And I think that the Trump administration, the State Department, has made a very wise decision by dropping this nomenclature of occupation and just referring to the territories as they are. The descriptive word would be disputed territories, and I think it was a wise decision. And I'd like to just add to that, in supporting Mara in Washington, it does not necessarily signal a change in policy. It does not. The Trump administration is now bringing a peace plan both to the Palestinians and to the Israelis, and perhaps neighbors in the neighborhood, to try to resolve this long-standing conflict.
Nour Odeh, come in.
Well, I mean, I really don't know where to begin. So if I understand it right, your guest in Israel would like us to believe that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem and other respected human rights organizations are not objective and should not be respected, that independent committees formed by the United Nations composed of reputable human rights and international law experts should also not be respected or listened to. This is farcical, really, and it takes the conversation into the realm of the absurd. There is an international order here that states have adhered to since the end of World War II for a very simple and very important reason, which is that if you don't adhere to laws and regulations and standards, and if you don't hold everybody accountable to the same standards, you're going to have chaos. Israel is not above the law. It has to be accountable. And as Israeli human rights organizations, as well as international organizations, have documented year after year, Israel is guilty of pervasive human rights violations. There is a system of oppression that denigrates the value of Palestinian human lives. It does not respect those rights. It does not respect the rights of the Palestinians, whether they're human rights or national rights. That's the reality. It's been very thoroughly documented, and it's not really in dispute. We can discuss semantics, we can delve into alternative realities, but the fact remains, you have right now an American administration that is part and parcel of the problem, of the conflict. It is not an independent party. It is not a peace broker. It will not be offering a peace plan. What it will be offering, if it offers anything, will be something that Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and the ambassador, the American ambassador to Israel, have brought together to mirror and whitewash the occupation, to mainstream it, to make sure that Arab allies forge relations with Israel at the expense of Palestinian rights. And that's why it won't work.
Listen, you all know how this works, and you've done this before. I can't get an extension on your satellite window, so you're going to drop off the air within about 20 seconds or so if I don't end this. And that's unfortunate, because we could continue, and I'd love to have you all back on the program again in the future. Nour Rudman, Nour Odeh, and Dan Diker, I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.